Mr. Plecas, your turn.
Thank you very much for the invite. Good morning, everyone. I come to you here as someone who spent at least the last decade studying the whole problem of drugs. I'm also on the board of directors for the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse. And I'm from British Columbia, and it's a place where, as some of you will know, has a very, very significant drug problem, and more than that. So why I support this legislation, and in a very big way, is for a number of reasons. One is I've seen and studied over the last decade how we've moved in British Columbia on the production side of drugs from where we had a handful of clandestine labs a decade ago, where we had only a few hundred grow-ops, whereas we sit here today in this room, there are, at the most conservative count, at least 16,000 grow operations. It is estimated to be, by several people, to be a $6 billion industry. I don't peg it at being $6 billion, but our research would say that it's definitely into the billions. Outdoor grow operations alone on Vancouver Island are such that the size of that industry makes it the single largest industry on Vancouver Island. And again, I remind you that this is from recent published research. We also know, we've seen this very clearly, that these are operations which have become increasingly sophisticated. They've become larger, and there is a very, very direct connection to organized crime. And in fact, it's fair to say that the development, the evolution of organized crime, gangs in British Columbia, moving from a decade ago where we had basically 8 to 10 gangs, organized crime groups, to where now we have, at the most conservative count, 130 and rising. We also have had a very distinct change, fundamental change in the cocaine business. And why do we have that? Well, we can trace that right back to we have enabled people to get into that business who otherwise never would have been in there, because the single largest source of funding for gangs and organized crime in BC is grow operations, period. And also remind you that at very minimum, 70% of drugs produced in British Columbia are exported. And we know that because we know how many people use. 16.8% of the province is user. Assuming how much they would smoke, we know what the size of the domestic market would be. The kinds of things I notice in BC, I also know is true and increasing in Alberta. I've studied grow-ops and clandestine labs in Alberta for a period of 10 years. And also, seriously, we have violence in the province of BC, gang-related, like we've never seen before in our history. Besides that, we have very clear evidence that tells us that the whole business of production itself, never mind what it leads to, has harms, immediate harms associated to it. And one of those harms is the damage done to property and the environment. Any conversation with any single person who is an industrial hygienist in the province of BC will tell you that they have not attended one of these operations without finding contamination and harms of one sort or another in 90+% of these operations. In fact, that is why we have communities all across Canada scrambling to put together tougher bylaws which will enable them to deal with the problems of remediation, that kind of thing. We also know that because of the nature of the way drugs are produced in this country, that they are consistently violating municipal bylaws, public safety standards. And we also know, disturbingly, that they steal hydro. And never mind that they steal hydro, so much so that, for example, we had one operation in BC recently where the hydro theft was $495,000. There is enough hydro consumed from drug production in BC alone, and you could check this with BC Hydro, to tell you that it is so much that we need to build one dam just to compensate for the amount of hydro that's consumed. So part of that is through excessive consumption. Another part of that is through people outright stealing it. And of course that's picked up by the average taxpayer because BC is a net importer of power. We also know that there's a risk to neighborhoods. There are, as something which is relatively new to Canada, is grow rips. It's a significant problem in British Columbia. There are gangs that have developed and are in no other business than doing grow rips. And it's not uncommon for those grow rips to involve innocent people because they mix up the house. We also know, and I think this is very, very important in terms of thinking about who would be affected by this legislation. I know because I've looked at all of those individuals who've been involved in BC and Alberta for over a decade in grow-ops. And on average, at least this is historically going for a decade, on average those people are people who have 13-year criminal histories and 7 prior convictions, and most of them have prior drug convictions. So we're not talking about people who don't know what they're doing. In fact, if you understand what it takes to build and operate and have permission to operate a commercially viable drug operation, you have to know what you're doing and you have to be involved with a number of players. We also know, disturbingly, that these individuals involved in this business are nonstop changing their MO. And never mind just on the side of production. We know this is the case in trafficking. We look at the whole business, the evolution of methamphetamine in Canada, the development of methamphetamine. We look at ecstasy. I mean, it's nonstop morphing into different types of drugs, nonstop efforts to avoid detection by law enforcement. Disturbingly, and I know this because I've also studied and alongside this effort, the response of the criminal justice system to this. The single most disappointing matter is what's happened with respect to how our courts have looked at these issues. And the fact of the matter is that in the most recent year that we have data, we have less than 10% of people who get convicted getting any kind of custody sentence. And that's a drop from what it was a decade earlier, a significant drop, which should be no surprise to you because, as you will all know from reports from Stats Canada, our courts have clearly moved to be more lenient. And if you measure that as one measure, the amount of time that people are sent to a term of custody. The courts haven't even seen fit to give fines of any kind of significant consequence. The average fine for a person involved in drug production for the last decade in BC and Alberta is $1,200, and the average theft of hydro per crop is $2,800. So we've got relatively few people going to custody, and on average a 4.5-month prison term. That should be very disappointing to us all because, as we all know, the goals of sentencing apparently are rehabilitation, public safety, general deterrence, specific deterrence, denunciation at very least. And I would challenge anyone to tell me how you could possibly accomplish any single one of those goals, never mind any together, with that kind of sentencing. And we certainly can't, and I think it goes beyond this particular issue. When we know right now by Stats Can's data that most people get a sentence of less than 30 days. We have 27% of our people before the courts for sentencing are getting a sentence of less than 8 days. Where on earth are we thinking that we're meeting the aims of sentencing with that kind of practice?